Welcome back to another Sunday Musing. Today's question is a rather loaded one in our postmodern world that we're in, and that is whether gender equality is compatible with God's design for our families. Well, what is that design? Let's go to President Hinckley when he was introducing the proclamation to the world on the family that summarizes what this design is.
By divine design, fathers are to preside over their families in love and righteousness, and are responsible to provide the necessities of life and protection for their families. Mothers are primarily responsible for the nurture of their children.
All right, so here we get three basic criteria for what fathers in particular are supposed to do: preside, provide, and protect, right? And then moms are primarily responsible for the nurture of the children. So as it pertains to fathers, at least, these three roles: provide, protect, and preside. Preside, provide, protect, however you want to order those. Now, protection is for obvious reasons. Men are the genetically superior, stronger gender. They can take care of women and children. They're the ones historically who fight wars, and they're the more aggressive gender. And so the protection aspect, makes obvious sense. Of course, there's no real eternal component to that, because after we die and we're living in our forever families in heaven, there's not really this need eternally to protect. So that's kind of interesting that that's really just a mortal kind of thing. And then same thing for provide, right? So men historically have been and doctrinally are suggested to be the primary breadwinners, ideally the sole breadwinners, because it's really hard for a mother to adequately nurture her children if she's delegating to the state that responsibility for their education and their care and their upbringing. And so that's why historically the church has emphasized the importance of mothers to stay in the home, to fulfill this nurturing role. Sure, playing into traditional gender stereotypes and whatnot, but they're traditional for a reason. Not all traditions are bad or wrong. And so the doctrinal basis of the church supports the fact that while mothers are primarily responsible for nurturing their children, that men are responsible as the hunters and gatherers and the doers and the workers and the ones bringing home the bacon to provide for the women and children. Interestingly, this also seems like a mortality-only role for fathers, because presumably there's no need to provide for your wife, your spouse, your children in heaven. Kind of interesting that those two pertain only to this life, apparently. But preside, if one of the roles of fathers is to preside over their families in love and righteousness, as Hinckley said, what does that mean? And that seems to suggest also, just by kind of intimating of what that means to preside, that is something that has both mortal relevance, as all three of these do, but also potentially some post-mortal heavenly relevance as well. So what does it mean to preside? If the man makes the decisions, the man has the authority, then the partnership, the marriage, is inherently unequal. It is not the same. There is no equality of power if the man is the one making the decisions, if the man is the one that has authority. If they both decide together and then execute whatever their decision is as they mutually agree upon it, then sure, that's kind of gender equality. They're both kind of co-participants in the decision factor. But then that means that the man isn't doing anything that the woman isn't doing. There's no particular gender roles. There's no distinct aspects of their gender. It's just two people who happen to have different anatomy, both kind of equally sharing responsibilities and decisions and execution of those decisions. If you imagine that the husband is half of the legislative branch, like Congress, right? So the husband is half of that, and the wife is the other half, so they both together comprise the legislative branch. But then if the man, in addition to being half of the legislative branch is also the executive branch, right? And the one that carries out the decisions and, acts upon what Congress decided together, then the wife does not have the equal authority and power if the man is the, executor of the state. It's interesting. If you go to the 1828 dictionary, as we like to do when we're understanding these church-type words, that says, and we know this is kind of common sense, that to preside means to be set over for the exercise of authority, to direct, control, and govern as the chief officer. Now, the difficulty here, as I ponder this issue, is that it's entirely unclear from the church's perspective about what this means. We'll get into that in just a minute. The first thing is that the church has been dealing for a long time with this kind of rising feminist movement in decades past and more recently. You think of people now who are like, oh, you can be a boss babe, anything a man can do, you can do, or erasing these boundaries, shattering ceilings, gender equality as a presumed social imperative that, we just ought to be doing because, that's what equality demands. And we've just elevated that to this, lofty ideal to which we should all aspire, and consequently undermine the different gender roles and fatherly, motherly responsibilities that the proclamation says and that church leaders in the past have shared. There's also this element of the feminist movement that's anti-authoritarian, right? Trying to fight the patriarchy. More recently in the church, that manifests itself as some women feeling like they, demand the priesthood because equality, right, demands it, and so we ought to have it too. This is likely why the church ultimately ended up fighting against the Equal Rights Amendment. This proposed amendment to the Constitution simply says that the equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. There were some early church leaders who endorsed this. In the 40s, there was a General Relief Society president that endorsed it. The General Young Women's president endorsed it. J. Reuben Clark, he told the Relief Society in 1950 not to oppose the bill for equal rights for women because there will be some of the women who will think it's a fine thing. So in other words, the political differences within the Relief Society of the church were a reason for at least one church leader to say, hey, let's not engage. That didn't last long. Of course, by the time we get to the 70s, Congress is now passing the ERA. It doesn't get ratified by enough states as a constitutional amendment requires, and so it doesn't go anywhere. But the church officially took a stand in the 70s, and since they've since renewed that because there's been a renewed push for something like the ERA, that the church has taken a stand against the ERA. Interestingly, back in the 70s, about 2/3 of Utahns had previously supported it. Right? We all want to look like we're nice people. We're good people. I don't hate women. Gender equality, yay! And you find that a lot of people are very warm to this, but church leaders had these underlying concerns about the implications of that and the societal trend that forcing this equality would have and removing these kind of different gender roles. Now, 50 years ago, to preside absolutely meant to be in charge. It's rather indisputable that was the perception of church leaders and consequently most members of the church at the time. Out of different examples to share, I'll start with this article from 1973 written by Brent Barlow. He became a BYU professor of marriage and family. He wrote an article in the 1973 Ensign. Interestingly, as of 2022, the church or the church media department has put an editor's note on this article at the top. I've never seen this before. Presumably, it to my knowledge, it hasn't been done before. That says articles in the magazine's archive may reflect practices and language of an earlier time. More current messages from the magazines on the relationship between husbands and wives include, and then go on to share all kinds of examples, a few examples of other talks to point people to. That's interesting. It's not like they automatically do this to every Ensign article prior to 1980, as you sometimes see news websites do now, right? Oh, this article you're reading is from more than 3 years ago. It may be outdated. Be careful sharing this or reading it, right? It wasn't that. The church doesn't have a just categorical editor's note on all these old articles. No, they're singling this one out. They're giving some references to more updated ones. Well, what's in this article that's so problematic that the church felt the need to add this editor's note? Here's a few statements from this Ensign article. Barlow says, the recent transition in the United States from a patriarchal to a democratic or even a matriarchal type of family organization has had its consequences. He further says that the recent trend in family government is also a departure from biblical teachings. The Apostle Paul admonished, wives, submit to your own husbands. He also taught that the husband is the head of the wife. In addition, Barlow continues, the Lord instructed Eve in the Garden of Eden that thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. So Barlow continues, he says that a Latter-day Saint husband or father presides over his wife and family in much the same way a bishop, stake president, or elders quorum president presides over the specific group to which he is called. Each acts with counselors and seldom makes decisions without carefully consulting with those whom he calls to assist him. So he's making the analogy between leadership in the home, priesthood authority in the home, and priesthood authority in these different councils and quorums. And he actually echoes an example I shared earlier, where when you have the Congress, right, the legislative branch, you have husband and wife. How does that make sense? Here's how Barlow put it. Imagine, for example, the confusion that would result if two bishops were appointed over your particular ward, and the first one got up in sacrament meeting and announced that the following Sunday the sacrament meeting would be held 1 hour earlier. While he was making his announcement, suppose the second bishop stood up and expressed his desire that the sacrament meeting be held at the original time. With two people presiding, would democratic principles work? Suppose you had two stake presidents, two elders quorum presidents, two Sunday school presidents, two primary and relief society presidents. How would the church function? Would law and order prevail? Similarly, should two people preside over each other in a marriage, particularly when one holds the priesthood and has been divinely designated to preside? So again, this clear, emphatic statement of what was widely recognized at the time and believed that to preside, this role that's been reaffirmed in the proclamation for fathers to preside, priesthood holders in particular, had to do with having the authority, not having two decision makers, not having co-equal partnership, but instead having the man have counselors, have a wife that he's counseling with and whatever, but that the man is making the final decision. So here's the final thing that I'll share from this article. He says that by strengthening the patriarchal order in Latter-day Saint homes, not only will the husband-wife relationship be enhanced, but the parent-child relationship will improve as well. When a wife challenges the right of her husband to officiate in the home, is it not a logical consequence that the children will challenge that right also? So he's got a number of statements like this. And as you might imagine, the feminists who are fighting for gender equality have shared this article many times in years to be like, look, this is what the church teaches, because this was like a potent summary of what many people were thinking at the time and prior. Thomas Jefferson, in his later years, he talks about how the Declaration of Independence was not this like new master stroke of sudden like new thought and inspiration. He says it was a kind of a summary and a reflection of the mind and the will of the people at the time. And so similarly with this article, I think it's fair to say that Barlow's writings were indicative of how church members understood what gender roles are, the design, God's design for the family, that mothers are nurturing, that fathers are provide, preside, and protect. So here in that same year in General Conference, here's Elder Tuttle from the 70 echoing these similar attitudes.
There is genuine concern over the diminishing role of fathers in the home. His influence is fading. Presiding responsibilities formerly assumed are either left to the mother or to agencies outside the home. This diminishing role is at the root of a multitude of our problems. Numerous things go awry when the scriptural family organization is upset. The father is the patriarch in the home. This means that the father is the presiding authority.
And long before 1973, there's nothing special about that year. Here's 1902. This is Joseph F. Smith, shortly after he becomes president. He says, "There is no higher authority in matters relating to the family organization, and especially when that organization is presided over by one holding the higher priesthood, than that of the father. The authority is time-honored, and among the people of God in all dispensations it has been highly respected and often emphasized by the teachings of the prophets who were inspired of God. The patriarchal order is of divine origin and will continue throughout time and eternity. There is, then, a particular reason why men, women, and children should understand this order and this authority in the households of the people of God, and seek to make it what God intended it to be, a qualification and preparation for the highest exaltation of his children. In the home, the presiding authority is always vested in the father, and in all home affairs and family matters, there is no other authority paramount." That was 1902. So, again, indicative of just this long-held tradition and understanding, and you might say, well, that's because they were responding to the culture of the time, and the culture has changed today, so we got to change with the times, because now it's about gender equality. And you might be right, because after all these statements that we have from early church leaders, modern ones, more recent ones, are singing a different tune. Let's start with Boyd Packer.
In the home, it is a partnership with husband and wife, equally yoked together, sharing in decisions, always working together. While the husband, the father, has responsibility to provide worthy and inspired leadership, his wife is neither behind him nor ahead of him, but at his side.
So now you're seeing words like partnership and equally yoked, right? No one is ahead. The wife isn't behind. There's no one at top. They're side to side. If they're equally yoked, right, like an ox, you're there side by side, implying the very kind of dual bishop, dual stake president, Congress, legislative, branch that was discussed. All right, here's Elder Richard Scott.
Is yours a culture where the husband exerts a domineering, authoritarian role, making all of the important decisions for the family? That pattern needs to be tempered so that both husband and wife act as equal partners, making decisions in unity for themselves and their family.
Again, equal partners, right? This becomes a recurring theme that we get from a lot more recent leaders. Here, more recently, is Elder Suarez.
Nurturing and presiding are interrelated and overlapping responsibilities, which means that mothers and fathers are obligated to help one another as equal partners and share a balanced leadership in their home. To preside means to help lead family members back to dwell in God's presence. It is important to observe that the government in the family follows the patriarchal pattern, differing in some respects from the priesthood leadership in the church. The patriarchal pattern entails that wives and husbands are accountable directly to God for the fulfillment of their sacred responsibilities in the family. It calls for a full partnership, a willing compliance with every principle of righteousness and accountability, and provides opportunities for development within an environment of love and mutual helpfulness. These special responsibilities do not imply hierarchy and absolutely exclude any kind of abuse or improper use of authority.
So here it's help lead, it's help meet, right? That the man doesn't have veto power over the wife, the man is not president and the woman vice president, a clear contradiction to what earlier church leaders were talking about and teaching and what church members widely understood. So, we're moving from men make the rules to men call the shots, but they should be nice about it and counsel with their wives, and really they're equal partners. And so there's this gender equality, equal partnership, equally yoked, but also the proclamation and past church leaders have said you're supposed to preside. So how do you preside in a co-equal arrangement? What does it actually mean to preside? If indeed a marriage is predicated on an equal partnership, if we take at face value what modern, more recent church leaders have said, then in that context, what do fathers do to preside? What is it actually? Is it just making sure that we're all doing family prayer and scripture study? Is it, making sure we get to church on time, that we're paying our tithing, all things that the mother can do as well, because we're equally yoked, so we can share responsibilities and, be equal partners. So what does it mean? To me, this is a little confusing. It's not really clear from the church about what it actually means to preside, because we can look to early statements and past church leaders about their clear direction about what presiding means, and I've shared just a few examples here. It means authority. It means decision-making. It means leadership. It means being the president. It means, being like the bishop of your home, and then you have counselors that you consult with. That's what past church leaders have said. But that contradicts what more recent church leaders have said. So what does it mean in an era of equal partnership and equally yoking and no president, vice president, and that type of concept? What does it mean to preside? There's this different understanding in the modern church. You might say that's based on revelation and progress and culture changing with the times. Some might say that it's, apostasy, and we're blending into the culture like the children of Israel, trying to be like unto all the nations. And that's precisely what we shouldn't be doing, that we should be standing strong on these traditions and on this doctrine, right? And come what may, even though we're counter-cultural, which I think ultimately we as Christians ought to be. I'm struck by the fact that, if the church is an extension of the home, if homes can be as holy as temples, there's a lot of this talk about, our homes and how holy they can be, and how we can kind of have a home as heaven on earth and all this kind of stuff, right? So if Joseph F. Smith is to be believed, home and family, these things are microcosms of what we are being prepared for and qualified for to have in the hereafter, to have in heaven. And so if we're one day to, be kings and queens, priests and priestesses, if we're to live up to this amazing doctrine we have about being creators, co-creators with God, and creating other planets and having, spiritual children and having an eternal increase, if we're preparing for that, if our home and our family now is like a microcosm of that, a little preparatory example, then it kind of makes sense that just as the church is governed by the priesthood, and just as the eternities are governed by God and the priesthood and these immutable eternal laws, that would be the case for us in the home as well. That would be the case in our families, this structure that continues after this life, not just in this life. So why is it then that we're getting these sudden changes where it's like, oh, no, we don't have the priesthood in charge, we don't have men in authority? We're responding to a culture where men are treated as bumbling idiots in TV, right, in movies, in modern media. The man has been emasculated. The women are in charge. The silly men don't know what they're doing, and you have this feminizing of our culture, and this emasculating of the men, that they're just another child, right? The woman is like, oh yeah, I got 3 kids and my husband, and oh, I got to take care of them all, right? And so we have this society where men are not stepping up. In fact, they're falling behind. And the church, rather than doubling down and saying, hey, men, step up, rise up, you need to lead. You are the patriarchs. You are the ones that are supposed to preside and provide and protect. We say, oh, no, you're equal partners. And that may be an essential, important thing. I'm not necessarily here to say that equal partnership is this inherently flawed concept. I'm just saying that it's very different than what early church leaders were saying, and yet more recent church leaders have not only changed that, but they continue to say that men should be presiding, right, in their homes with love and righteousness. But what does that even mean? The church doesn't really teach that or contextualize it. They haven't clarified that in this new approach to equal partnership and equal yoking and so forth, what it actually means to preside. So there's mixed signals, mixed messages, and I think we need a lot more clarity here from the church if fathers are going to step up. How do we get men to step up and fulfill their role if no one can define what that is? Like, go to your ward and next Sunday and just ask 3 or 4 or 5 people, hey, what do you think it means for men to preside in the home, in their family? And you'll get some confused looks, I'm sure. you'll get different answers, a lot of uncertainty. These superficial answers like, helping look after the, kids and making sure we're saying family prayer together and, getting to church on time. I think the fact that there would be so much confusion and lack of clarity is reflective of the fact that it's unclear from the leaders of the church and the teachings because they conflict with one another on this issue. So is it an eternal principle like Joseph F. Smith and others were saying? And if so, then it's eternal, right? It's not going to change, despite more recent church leaders trying to modify it to be responsive to changing postmodern cultural feminist trends. Or were the President Smiths of the world wrong in saying that's an eternal principle? And they were part of this antiquated society that just had these deeply rooted gender norms that we needed to move past in our society and grow out of, because it is an equal partnership and we should be equally yoked. So maybe the early church leaders were wrong. That is a viable answer. But the problem is there is no answer. There is no clarification that we receive from the church. And therefore we have kind of the historical modern leaders and the more recent modern leaders saying different things. And therefore men, if they're confused, they're not going to stand up and fulfill their role that they don't even understand what it is. And so is it any surprise that in our church, we don't see some divergent trend from the culture of men, being another child and not really rising up and being a strong leader in their home, because that is countercultural. That is not something that, people in our culture, the way men typically act today. And so we've been enculturated as children and teenagers and adults now growing up in this postmodern feminist world, where our institutions have been highly feminized. We've all been taught by teachers in elementary school, 98% plus of which are females. And so, a lot of people lack male leadership. They lack male mentorship, role models that they should be emulating. What does it even look like today for a strong man to be an authority in his family and to be the decider? You get now like some of these like trad wife kind of trends, right? Where you get some of these like mainline Christians, evangelicals that are trying to like really lean into the traditional gender roles, the alpha male and the trad wife and so forth. But in our church, you don't have that. You have the signal of equal yoking and elevating the feminine. And look, again, I'm not saying that's wrong. Maybe that is the right answer. I am currently unclear on that. I just know that I look at these different like polar opposite statements and someone's wrong. Either the more recent church leaders are wrong and they're just like embracing the culture wrongly, or the earlier church leaders were wrong and they were embracing their own culture of traditional gender norms. All I know is that without clarity, without resolution of these differences and these conflicting statements, men are just going to be confused, caught in the middle, without the clarity needed to actually step up and fulfill their role. They're being told to preside. No one has any clue what that means, especially if we're equally yoked. So I'd be curious in the comments to get your thoughts. I know this for some, especially in all the gender wars and so forth we have today, it can be polarizing, that there's a lot of kind of feminist type people that do buy into gender equality as this social imperative. And so it's kind of interesting to consider, like, what is the ideal? What does God actually want? What is the design for his family? And is it compatible with this push for gender equality? Or does, in fact, God prefer, or is it more compatible with the doctrine to have more traditional gender norms, as the proclamation really intimates, about the mom, being the nurturer and the man being the father, being the protector and the provider and the presiding authority in the family. So a lot has changed, but confusion abounds. And I feel sorry for my fellow priesthood holders and fathers and men in the church without sufficient clarity to know what we're supposed to be doing. We know how to provide. We know how to protect. Like, those are very clear. Nobody knows how to preside. What does that mean? What does it mean to you? Leave a comment below. I'd be curious to get your take. And until next time, we'll see you on Sunday.